Yeah, there was a little back and forth about the theme, so I ended up with the title Climate Change and Conflict, but I can talk about other environmental factors in conflict in the Q&A session if you like. But this will be a relatively brief presentation, so I thought I'd focus on the most important current environmental issue. Now, of course, I'm not a climate change expert. I do hope I know something about conflict, so I'll start at the conflict end. And this is a graph that shows the number of armed conflicts in the period since World War II. The green area, that's the internal conflicts. The blue area, international conflicts. And what we see from this graph is that there have always been relatively few international conflicts, and the number's been declining. For some years recently there have been none. The internal conflicts have been numerically dominant since at least the end of the 1950s. They rose rather dramatically during most of the Cold War and have declined since, and then have increased a little bit again in the last few years. This graph, however, is a little bit deceptive in that nobody records internal conflicts in non-independent countries. So part of the rise in conflict during the Cold War is simply more countries becoming independent and therefore conflict being recorded. So if we correct for that by dividing by the number of independent countries, we can see that the increase during the Cold War is not quite as drastic, and the decrease after the end of the Cold War is more drastic. We still have this little increase in the number of armed conflicts in the past 5 years. This includes all conflicts with more than 25 battle deaths in a single year. So it's a relatively low threshold for being included. If we look only at wars, and that is conflicts, armed conflict with more than 1,000 battle deaths in a year, then the number, of course, is lower. The increase is not as dramatic, and there's no increase in the past 5 years, no increase in large conflicts in the past 5 years. Even so, of course, conflicts vary very much in size, and if we look at the total number of battle deaths for all conflicts, and this is for the entire 20th century and up until 2008, again, the blue area, international conflicts, the green area, internal conflicts. We see that this graph is completely dominated by two conflicts, World War I and World War II. So much so that it's difficult to see what's going on in the period after World War II. So if we enlarge that area, we see that the conflict picture is dominated by certain very large wars. There's the Chinese Civil War over here, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the Iran-Iraq War, and the Soviet-Afghanistan War, which was an internationalized civil war, the war in the DRC, and then Iraq and Afghanistan out here. Again, there's a slight increase in the last few years, but it's important to keep that in the perspective of the more long-term development. We see that this increase is relatively modest compared to the kind of bloody wars we've had in the period since World War II. The encouraging thing about this graph, of course, is that although it's very much dependent on individual wars, the peaks tend to be lower, so there's a declining trend over time. As has been pointed out many times, and certainly I'm sure it's been pointed out at this conference, battle deaths is not the complete death toll resulting from war. There are also indirect long-term deaths. I've usually said that it's difficult to say whether indirect deaths are now a larger proportion of all deaths than what used to be the case. There's the main reason why indirect deaths might be higher is that most wars take place in poor countries. But there are some other reasons why they might actually be lower, and the Human Security Report, which was just published a couple of days ago, I think presents a convincing case that it doesn't seem entirely unlikely that even indirect deaths might have gone down, mainly because wars are more limited geographically. They don't involve such large land forces, and health facilities generally are better than they used to be. So, for instance, the idea that the war in the DRC was the largest war since World War II is not really a viable idea. The Korean War, for instance, was much larger war, both in terms of direct deaths and indirect deaths. Anyway, enter climate change. Is it the case that this broad trend towards a more peaceful world is jeopardized by the prospect of climate change? Many people think so. And in the past 5, 6, 7 years, you've had a number of statements from politicians, NGOs, journalists, some researchers, that climate change is a major security threat. Jan Egeland, the former head of OCHA at the UN, and also Ban Ki-moon, the President Secretary General of the UN, have both said that Darfur is the first of many climate wars. The chair of the Norwegian Nobel Committee, in justifying the award of the Nobel Peace Prize to Al Gore and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in 2007, said that climate change may induce large-scale migration, lead to greater competition for the resources, and this may result in increased danger of violent conflicts and wars within and between states. And recently that opinion was endorsed by President Barack Obama in his Nobel Prize speech, although he did not get it for his environmental policies. But he still commented that there's little scientific dispute that if we do nothing, we will face more drought, more famine, more mass displacement, all of which will fuel more conflict for decades.